Somewhere in Oxford, England, in a gallery of the Ashmolean Museum, there sits a piece of baked clay that most people walk past without stopping. It is not large. You could hold it in one hand if the curators would let you. 4 equal sides, each face roughly 20 centimetres tall and 9 centimetres wide, the colour of pale desert sand gone slightly darker at the edges where time has touched it. It is a prism, a 4-sided column of fired clay, and it has been sitting in that museum since 1923, when a British expedition member named Herbert Weld-Blundell brought it back from the dust of southern Iraq and presented it to the university. The registration number stamped in the collection records is Ashmolean Museum 1923.444. Scholars call it the Weld-Blundell Prism, or simply WB444, and for those who know what it contains, it is one of the most quietly extraordinary objects on the planet. Wherever you are listening to this tonight, whether you are in a bedroom with the lights already low, or stretched across a couch while the rest of the house has gone quiet, or tucked somewhere in a corner of the world where it is still early and the day has only just released you, drop a comment and let us know. The question this object raises has been sitting unanswered for over 4,000 years. One more night of sitting with it together will not hurt. Turn the prism slowly in your mind. Each of its 4 sides is inscribed in 2 tight columns, the wedge-shaped marks of Sumerian cuneiform pressed into the clay by a scribe who lived around 1800 BC during the reign of a king named Suen-Magir of the city of Asin. The scribe may have worked by lamplight, a small oil flame throwing shadows across his writing surface. He pressed each wedge into the soft clay with deliberate care, because what he was recording was not a shopping list or an administrative ledger. He was recording something that, from his own cultural perspective, was the entire history of the world. Every king who had ever ruled, in every city that had ever held power, from the very beginning of time down to his own day. The Sumerian King List. That is what he was writing. Most of it reads like what you would expect from an ancient record of rulers: a city name, a king's name, a number of years, and then the city falls and the kingship passes on to the next. Page after page of this, dynasty after dynasty, names becoming more recognisable as the list descends toward historical time. Gilgamesh appears, and Sargon of Akkad, and the kings of Ur, whose royal tombs Leonard Woolley excavated a century ago. These are real people, confirmed by multiple independent sources. The list, for all its problems as a historical document, plants its roots in something genuine. But then there is the beginning. The very first section of the Weld-Blundell Prism, the opening passage that precedes everything else, describes a time before recorded history, before the cities that archaeology can find, before the flood that the text treats as a civilizational boundary as absolute as a wall. It describes 8 kings who ruled across 5 cities for a combined total of 241,200 years. And of those 5 cities, the second one mentioned, the city that received kingship after the first city fell, is a place called Bad-tibira. 3 kings held Bad-tibira before the flood. Their names were Enmenluana, who ruled for 43,200 years, Enmengalana, who ruled for 28,800 years, and Dumuzid the Shepherd, who ruled for 36,000 years. Together, 108,000 years of unbroken rule in a single city that the text treats as historical fact. And here is what makes Bad-tibira different from the other 4 pre-flood cities on this list. Here is the thing that stops you when you read it slowly. Dumuzid, the third and final king of Bad-tibira before the great flood swept everything away, is not merely a name in a list. He is a god, one of the most documented, most sung about, most mythologically elaborated divine figures in all of Sumerian literature. He has his own epic cycle. His death and return are mourned across dozens of surviving tablets. His consort is the goddess Inanna, Queen of Heaven. His story was still being told, still being ritually enacted, for 2,000 years after this prism was fired. A god is listed as the last king of Bad-tibira, and the text moves on without explanation, as if there is nothing unusual about this at all. Tonight, that is the question we are going to sit with, not whether the numbers are literal or metaphorical, not whether the flood happened, not what the Sumerians really meant. All of those questions belong to the chapters ahead. Tonight, we begin with the prism itself, small, pale, four-sided, sitting in Oxford, and with the single most persistent puzzle it contains. Why does the Sumerian King List record that a bloodline of 3 figures, including a deity who governed vegetation, shepherds, and the turning of seasons, held the throne of a city called Badtibira for 108,000 years before the world was destroyed and rebuilt? The scribe who pressed those words into clay believed the answer was worth preserving. He believed it badly enough to make sure the clay was fired, so it would last. And it did. It lasted 4,000 years to reach this room, this night, this question. The land between the rivers. To understand what the Sumerian King List is claiming about Bad-tibira, you first have to understand who the Sumerians were, and why anything they wrote deserves this kind of attention. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which today corresponds to the lower portion of Iraq, is one of the strangest places in the archaeological record. By any measure of what we call civilization, things happened there earlier and more intensely than almost anywhere else on Earth. Writing appears in this region around 3200 BC in the city of Uruk as a practical system for recording trade and administrative transactions. It is the oldest known writing in the world. Cities appear here before they appear almost anywhere else. Not villages, not farming settlements, but actual planned urban centres with monumental architecture, administrative hierarchies, professional specialisation, long-distance trade networks, and what can only be described as a formal relationship between rulers and the divine. The people who built this world are the Sumerians. They spoke a language, Sumerian, that belongs to no known language family. It is not related to the Semitic languages around it, not related to anything to the north or east or west. It stands alone in the linguistic record, which has fascinated scholars for over a century without producing a satisfying explanation. They called their land Kalam, the Black Land, a reference to the extraordinarily fertile dark soil deposited by river flooding, in contrast to the red-brown desert beyond. They called themselves Ugsagig Ga, the black-headed people, a designation that appears in religious texts and royal inscriptions alike. Their civilization, broadly speaking, spans from roughly 4500 BC to around 1900 BC, when Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language and passed into the status of a classical learned tongue, the way Latin functioned in medieval Europe. But the period that concerns us most, the period when the great cities flourished, when the temples rose, when the texts that survive were written and preserved, runs from approximately 3200 BC to 2000 BC. 3,000 years of history compressed into clay. The geography shaped everything. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing south and southeast toward the Persian Gulf, created the fundamental conditions of Sumerian life. Annual flooding that deposited rich silt and made grain agriculture extraordinarily productive, but also a flat, almost featureless alluvial plain that offered no natural defensive barriers, no stone for building, no timber except what could be floated downriver from distant mountains. The Sumerians built with mud brick. They irrigated with elaborate canal systems. They traded obsessively for the raw materials their landscape did not provide. And they organised all of this through cities, autonomous city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own temple complex, its own ruler, its own fields and canals and archive rooms full of clay tablets. What we know about Sumerian civilization, we know almost entirely from those tablets. Hundreds of thousands of them have been excavated since the mid-19th century. They contain economic records, legal codes, school exercises, astronomical observations, medical diagnoses, hymns, epic poetry, lamentations, letters between merchants, lists of animals and plants and stones, descriptions of rituals, instructions for brewing beer. The range is vast. And somewhere in that archive, composed during the Ur III period, the third dynasty of Ur, which flourished from roughly 2112 to 2004 BC, and surviving most completely in Old Babylonian period copies, sits the Sumerian King List. It is not, in the strict sense, a history book. Modern scholars are careful about this. Peter Steinkeller of Harvard University, one of the foremost authorities on the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia, has argued that the scale was originally created during the Akkadian Empire to legitimize Akkad's claim to the inheritance of Kish. Mark van der Meeroop, in his standard textbook A History of the Ancient Near East, notes that the composition's reliability as a historical source is severely limited and urges that it should only be used with caution. The dynasties listed do not all succeed each other sequentially, some overlap with each other, and several important cities known from other sources are simply omitted. So scholars are right to be cautious. The scale is a literary and ideological document as much as a historical one. It was used by successive dynasties to position themselves within a cosmic narrative of inherited kingship. But there is something the caution does not fully resolve. When a text is used for political legitimation, the legitimating material has to carry weight with its audience. You do not anchor your political authority in stories that everyone knows to be completely invented. The scale works politically, rhetorically, ideologically, because it draws on traditions that the Sumerian audience found credible and resonant. The question of where those traditions came from, what substrate of cultural memory they preserve, is not answered simply by labelling the text propaganda. The Antediluvian section in particular requires a different kind of attention than the rest. The post-flood dynasties can be checked against archaeology, against other texts, against seal inscriptions. They have varying degrees of historical accuracy. But the 8 kings of the 5 pre-flood cities inhabit a different register entirely. They are not offered as recent history. They are offered as something older, something that existed before the flood erased the previous world, and kingship had to descend from heaven all over again. That phrase, kingship descended from heaven, is the opening line of the Sumerian King List. In Sumerian, Nam Lugal anta ed diabar, literally, after the kingship from heaven had come down. The word Nam Lugal, kingship, is the text's own name for itself. It appears in the very first line and frames everything that follows. Kingship is not, according to this text, something that human beings invented or developed. It is something that arrived. It came from somewhere else. It was placed in a specific city, and when that city fell, it moved to the next. The theological implications of this framing are significant, and we will return to them. But for now, observe what it means for Bad-tibira. The city did not simply rise to prominence through conquest or trade. According to the text, kingship, the divine mandate to rule, was transferred to Bad-tibira by the same cosmic mechanism that had placed it in Eridu before. Something chose Bad-tibira second. Something decided that this city and these 3 figures and these particular spans of time would receive and hold the mandate of heaven before the flood. Whether that something was a theological construct, a mathematical pattern, an astronomical encoding, or the dimly preserved memory of an actual historical reality is precisely what we cannot yet say. But it is worth knowing, as we move forward, that the Sumerians themselves did not consider this a small claim. The word Namlugal, kingship, carried the weight of cosmic order. To say that Bad-tibira held it for 108,000 years was not a casual observation, it was a declaration, the discovery of the list. The Sumerian King List did not come to the world neatly. It arrived in pieces over decades across multiple excavation seasons and multiple continents, assembled slowly by scholars who were still learning to read a language that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. The first fragment appeared in 1906. Herman Vorath Hilprecht, an Assyriologist working with material from the University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur, published a small cuneiform tablet that contained part of what would eventually be recognised as the King List tradition. Nippur, ancient Nibru, was the religious centre of Sumer, the city of the god Enlil, keeper of the Tablet of Destinies, and the most important repository of written texts in the ancient world. Across multiple excavation seasons in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the University of Pennsylvania team recovered tens of thousands of tablets from Nippur's ruins, most of which went to the museum in Philadelphia. Among them, scattered across different excavation layers, were the first fragments of the skull. The second major publication came in 1911 from a very different find. Jean Vincent Schiele, a Dominican priest and one of the most prolific cuneiformists of his era, published a tablet that had come from Susa in ancient Elam, modern southwestern Iran. This text, known as the Schiele dynastic tablet, contained a portion of the King List running from the second dynasty of Uruk through the third dynasty of Ur. It confirmed that the tradition was not isolated to one Sumerian city. It had spread east across the mountains, carried by scribes or conquerors or pilgrims into a different cultural world entirely. But the object that transformed the study of the King List arrived in 1922, when Herbert Weld-Blundell mounted an expedition to southern Iraq and acquired the four-sided clay prism that now bears his name. The circumstances of its acquisition are somewhat opaque. Weld-Blundell was a sponsor and patron of excavations rather than a professional archaeologist, and the prism may have been purchased from a dealer at the site of Lhasa rather than formally excavated. He brought it to England and presented it to the Ashmolean Museum in 1923, where the Assyriologist Stephen Herbert Langdon promptly published it in Oxford editions of Cuneiform Texts, Volume 2nd. Langdon's publication sent a ripple through the scholarly world. Here was the most complete surviving version of the skull. 4 sides, 8 columns, covering the full sweep of Sumerian kingship from the Antediluvian period down to the Isin dynasty of Langdon's own era. And the Antediluvian section, the 8 kings of the 5 pre-flood cities, was all there, intact, beginning with that extraordinary opening line about kingship descending from heaven. The scholars who read it for the first time in modern translation found themselves facing a document that violated every expectation about what ancient king lists should look like. Lists from Egypt, from Assyria, from later Babylonia, all of them contained long reigns, semi-mythological early figures, blurred boundaries between gods and kings. But nothing quite like this. Nothing that opened with 5 cities and 8 rulers, and nearly 250,000 years of prehistory, all stated with the same flat bureaucratic calm as the measurable historical dynasties that followed. The dominant response was Thorkild Jacobson's. Jacobson, a Danish-American Assyriologist who would go on to become one of the most influential Mesopotamian scholars of the 20th century, published his landmark study The Sumerian King List in 1939 as Volume 11 of the Oriental Institute's Assyriological Studies series. It remains, nearly 90 years later, the foundational scholarly treatment of the text. Jacobson's argument was careful and, in its way, generous. He believed that the antediluvian kings were not pure invention. The names, he argued, derived from older administrative lists that scribes had kept for practical purposes, real records of real rulers, however distorted and elaborated. The impossible reign lengths were not, he suggested, a sign of fabrication. They reflected a tendency, known also among other peoples of antiquity, to form very exaggerated ideas of the length of human life in the earliest times. The Sumerians looked back at their remotest past and assumed that the earliest rulers must have been grander, longer lived, more semi-divine than those of the present. Jacobson's solution to the impossible numbers was to replace them. He calculated average reign lengths of 20 to 30 years and worked backwards from dates established by other means to create a historical chronology where individual pre-Sargonic kings could be approximately dated. It was a heroic act of scholarly reconstruction, and it produced a workable framework for early dynastic Mesopotamian history that dominated the field for decades, but it left questions untouched. Jacobson's method required treating the reign lengths as errors to be corrected, which assumed you already knew what the correct answer should look like. It could not account for why the numbers were what they were. It could not explain why they were mathematically precise multiples of a specific Sumerian unit of measure, and it could not address the deepest anomaly in the Antediluvian section at all, the presence of Dumuzid the Shepherd as the last king of Bad-tibira, a figure whose mythology was so extensively developed across Sumerian literature that no one could plausibly argue he was simply a historical king with an unusual name. Since Jacobson, the scholarly conversation has moved considerably. The emergence of the Ur-3 Sumerian King List, a version dating to the reign of Shulgi, the second king of Ur-3, around 2084 to 2037 BC, and therefore older than all the old Babylonian copies, including the Weld-Blundell Prism, complicated the picture dramatically. Because this oldest version does not contain the Antediluvian section at all, it begins with Kish. The 8 kings of the 5 pre-flood cities are simply absent. This single fact reshapes the entire inquiry. If the oldest known version of the scale lacks the Antediluvian section, then that section was a later insertion, something added to the tradition after the Year 3 period, during the societal upheaval that followed the collapse of the Third Dynasty of Ur around 2004 BC. Steinkeller has argued that this insertion served a political purpose. By prefacing the list with a series of primordial pre-flood kings, later city-states could dilute the overwhelming importance of Kish as the first post-flood recipient of kingship, making their own claims to legitimacy seem less dependent on that particular lineage. It is a coherent argument, but it does not explain where the Antediluvian section's content came from. You cannot insert something into a text unless that something already exists. If the 5 cities and 8 kings were added to the scale during or after the Ur-3 collapse, they were drawn from somewhere, some older tradition, some separate source, some existing cultural memory that the scribes knew their audience would recognize. The insertion was political. The material being inserted may have been far older, which brings us back to Bad-tibira and to the 3 figures who, according to every version of the skill that contains the Antediluvian section, held the throne of that city before the world was washed away, when kingship descended from heaven. Before we can look closely at Bad-tibira's 3 kings, we need to understand what the Sumerian King List means when it says kingship descended from heaven. Because the text is not using loose poetic language, it is making a specific cosmological claim, one that is woven through the entire fabric of Sumerian religious and political thought, and understanding it changes how we read every name and every number that follows. The Sumerian word Lugal means, in its most literal sense, big man, from Luman and Gal, great or big. It is standardly translated as king, but kingship as a concept, as a cosmic institution, is Nam Lugal, where Nam is a prefix that transforms nouns into abstract categories, in the way that adding hood or ship transforms English words. Nam Lugal is not merely the condition of being a king, it is kingship as a force, an entity, a thing that can move and be placed and descend from one location to another. The opening formula of the scale, Nam Lugal Antediluvian, encodes this cosmological understanding. Kingship came down from heaven. It did not arise. It did not develop. It did not emerge from human political organisation. It arrived from a higher register of existence and was placed in Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, the city founded at the edge of the freshwater ocean called the Abzu, the domain of Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water. This concept that legitimate political authority is a divine gift transmitted from the cosmic realm to the earthly one runs through Sumerian literature as one of its most persistent themes. In the text known as the Mi, the divine powers, the sacred attributes of civilization, kingship is listed alongside writing, music, law, craftsmanship, and the descent into the underworld as one of the fundamental Mi that the gods possess and occasionally transmit to the human world. Inanna famously acquires the Mi from Enki through a combination of banquet, wine, and strategic timing in the mythological text known as Inanna and the God of Wisdom. She brings them to her city, Uruk. Kingship comes with them. The ideological point is consistent. Civilization's institutions are not human inventions. They are divine gifts, transmitted from above to below, maintained by the correct relationship between kings and gods, and capable of being removed if that relationship breaks down. This is what the kingship was taken to mean. Each time a city falls in the scale. The city did not simply lose a war. It lost the divine mandate, the Nam Lugal, which then relocated to the next city. And the question of why it relocated, what determined the sequence, what governed the transfer, is a question the text does not answer directly. It simply records the sequence. Eridu, then Bad-tibira, then Larag, then Zimbir, then Shuruppak. These 5 cities and these 8 kings are what the text tells us existed before the flood. Now here is an anomaly that scholars have discussed and never fully resolved. Of those 5 cities, the earthly Sumerian King List, the oldest version, the one that predates the Weld-Blundell Prism by 2 to 3 centuries, does not mention any of them. It begins after the kingship descended from heaven. The kingship was in Kish. Kish is the first post-flood recipient in every version of the scale. In the Year 3 version, it is also the first recipient. Full stop. The antediluvian cities simply do not appear. The scholarly consensus, following Steinkeller, is that the antediluvian section was inserted into the tradition during the Old Babylonian period, sometime between the Year 3 collapse around 2004 BC and the composition of the Weld-Blundell Prism around 1800 BC. The insertion served political purposes, reducing Kish's dominance, enlarging the cosmological scope of the narrative, and positioning the flood as a second beginning of civilized history rather than its first. But consider what this means from a different angle. The antediluvian section, if it was inserted during this period, was not invented from nothing by a single scribe. The cities named Eridu, Badtibira, Larag, Zimbir, Shuruppak are real places. All of them attested in multiple other ancient sources, all of them genuinely old, all of them located in the same geographic corridor of southern Mesopotamia. The names of the kings, while impossible to verify historically, are linguistically coherent Sumerian constructions with meaningful etymologies. The flood itself is attested in multiple independent Mesopotamian sources: the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, all placing it in this same tradition. And the numbers. The numbers are not random. They are precise multiples of a specific Sumerian mathematical unit, arranged in a pattern that any numerate Sumerian scribe would have recognized immediately as structured, deliberate, mathematically intentional. This is not what invented fiction looks like. Invented king lists, lists manufactured purely for political purposes, tend to use vague or round numbers. The antediluvian reigns use specific multiples of 3,600 with an internal consistency that points not toward invention but toward transmission. Something was transmitted. The question is what? The Sumerian King List's antediluvian section is, at minimum, a window onto a stratum of Mesopotamian cultural memory that predates the Old Babylonian period. Whether it preserves actual historical records, astronomical data, religious cosmology, or some combination of all three, is a question we will approach from several different angles. But it cannot be dismissed as simple fiction. Fiction does not behave like this. And at the centre of this stratum, receiving kingship second, holding it through 3 named figures for 108,000 years, is Bad-tibira, the city of the copperworkers. There is a mound in southern Iraq, in the province of Dhi Qar, sitting roughly between the modern town of Ashatra and the ruins of ancient Larsa, approximately 25 kilometres southwest of what was once the city of Girsu. The mound is called Tel al-Madineh. It covers approximately 1 square mile of flat alluvial plain, its highest point rising perhaps 8 to 10 metres above the surrounding landscape. When the British archaeologist Raymond P. Doherty visited it for a single day in 1927, he noted baked bricks scattered across the surface, door sockets, flint saw blades, and a bronze needle. Some bricks bore the inscription of Amar Sin of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. There was vitrified brick that had been fused by extreme heat, evidence of a city that burned. When Vaughan E. Crawford of the Metropolitan Museum of Art visited in 1965, surface pottery indicated continuous occupation until approximately 1500 BC. In 2017, a research team found a broken copper figurine of a bearded hero tentatively dated to the early dynastic period, the era from roughly 2900 to 2350 BC. That is nearly everything archaeology can tell us about Tel al-Madineh, which is the proposed location of ancient Bad-tibira. The site has never been formally excavated. No stratigraphic sequences, no temple foundations, no archive of tablets, no palace, no city wall fully mapped. It sits in the Iraqi landscape, heavily looted according to satellite imagery, its surface scarred by the pits of illegal diggers, its deeper layers untouched by systematic science. For a city that the Sumerian King List places second only to Eridu in the Antediluvian cosmic order, the silence of the archaeological record is something close to stunning. The name Bad-tibira is itself informative. In Sumerian, Bad or Beat means wall or fortification, the outer defensive wall of a city. Tibira appears to derive from a term meaning coppersmith or metalworker, related to the Sumerian word for copper, urudu. The full name translates with varying scholarly renderings as Wall of the Copperworkers, Fortification of the Smiths, or City of the Metalworkers. It is a name that encodes a specific economic and technological identity. This was a city associated with metalworking, with the smelting, alloying and casting of copper and bronze. In the context of early Mesopotamian history, this is a significant designation. The transition from stone tools to copper and bronze metallurgy, the technological shift that defines the boundary between the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Ages, is one of the defining transformations of ancient civilization. Metalworking required not only skill but a sophisticated supply chain. Copper ore had to come from distant mountains, fuel had to be procured and managed, specialized knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted across generations. Cities that controlled metallurgical production occupied a strategically privileged position in ancient trade networks. The fact that Bad-tibira carries a name specifically referencing copper and metalworking, and that it appears in the scale at the very dawn of civilized time, suggests that this was not a random or generic city. It was a place with a specific technological identity that its inhabitants considered fundamental to its character, important enough to name the entire settlement after. The city's religious architecture reinforces this picture. The principal temple at Bad-tibira was called the Emush-Kalama, House of the Radiance of the Land, which was the temple of Lulal, a deity associated with the city as its patron god. The text known as Inanna's Descent to the Underworld mentions this temple explicitly. In that narrative, when Inanna returns from the realm of the dead and demons accompany her to demand a substitute, they pass through Bad-tibira and find Lulal sitting in squalor, dressed in mourning, prostrated, miserable. The demons spare him. They move on to Uruk, where they find Dumuzi the Shepherd sitting on a magnificent throne, dressed in splendour, seemingly unmoved by Inanna's ordeal. And it is Dumuzi they take. The temple of Dumuzi at Bad-tibira was called the Emush, House of Radiance. and its existence is confirmed not only by literary texts, but by inscriptions from real historical rulers. Entemena, the ruler of Lagash, who lived around 2400 BC, records building or restoring the Emush temple for Dumuzi and Inanna. The text reads in part that he built the Emush, their beloved temple, restoring it, a restoration, implying a pre-existing structure of some antiquity. One of the temple hymns composed by Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and the world's first named author, 2285 BC, is dedicated specifically to Bad-tibira and its Emush temple of Dumuzi. These are not mythological references. These are inscriptions on physical objects found in the ground, cones, tablets, foundation deposits left by real rulers who genuinely believed they were building temples in a genuinely real city. Bad-tibira was a functioning Sumerian city-state from at least the early dynastic period through the old Babylonian period. Its temples were real. Its gods were real in the sense that matters for cultural history, people organised their lives around them, kings built monuments to them, scribes hymned them, and the last antediluvian king of that city was one of those gods. The Ur-Nammu Canal inscription, found at the proposed site of Bad-tibira, records that Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur, the man whose law code is among the oldest on Earth, dug the Iturungal Canal for the goddess Inanna, Lady of Inanna, his lady. The Iturungal Canal was the primary waterway connecting Bad-tibira to the network of Sumerian cities. Its construction or renovation by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BC places it firmly in the real hydraulic geography of ancient southern Mesopotamia. Water flowed through Bad-tibira. Grain grew in fields fed by that water. People lived there. A city real enough for Ur-Nammu to dig a canal for. A city real enough for Entemena to restore a temple in. A city real enough for Enheduanna to hymn. And according to the oldest cosmological record of Sumerian civilization, a city that held the divine mandate of kingship, the Namlugal, for 108,000 years before the flood. The gap between those two registers of reality, the historically attested city and the cosmologically claimed pre-flood dynasty, is the space this investigation inhabits. It is a large space. It is not, however, an empty one. The three who held the throne. The Antediluvian section of the Sumerian King List names Bad-tibira's 3 pre-flood kings with the same flat administrative economy it uses for every other entry. City name, king's name, years ruled. Next king. The prose is stripped of everything except the essentials. In Bad-tibira, Enmen-Luanna ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Garlanna ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid the Shepherd ruled for 36,000 years. 3 kings, they ruled for 108,000 years. Then Bad-tibira fell, and the kingship was taken to Lurag, 9 lines, 108,000 years. And yet each of these 3 figures, examined closely, opens onto a different dimension of the question we are pursuing. Begin with the first, Enmen-Luanna. The name is Sumerian, and it is not a simple name. En is a Sumerian title, carrying connotations of lordship, religious authority, and stewardship. It is used for high priests, divine beings, and rulers with sacred functions. Men relates to the divine crown, the circlet of power worn by gods and kings. Lu means man, person, or shepherd. Anna is a variant of An, the sky or heaven, and also the name of the supreme sky god An. So Enmen-Luanna might be rendered as something like Lord of the Heavenly Crown of the Shepherd Man, or Lord of the Crown, Man of Heaven, a title rather than a personal name in any modern sense, encoding a specific combination of divine, royal and pastoral authority. He ruled for 43,200 years, the longest reign of any Bad-tibiran king, and the longest of any antediluvian ruler across all 5 cities, except for Enmen-Luanna himself. He is paired in a Mesopotamian text called the Uruk List of Kings and Sages with a figure named Emeduga, one of the Apkallu, the 7 antediluvian sages who are described in Mesopotamian tradition as semi-divine beings who taught humanity civilization's arts. Each antediluvian king in the Uruk list of kings and sages is paired with an Apkallu. Enmenluana's companion sage, Enmeduga, is one of the 7. This pairing is not in the skill itself, but in a separate textual tradition that corroborates the Antediluvian King List from a different angle, confirming that Enmenluana was not an isolated invention, but a figure embedded in a broader Mesopotamian cosmological tradition about the period, before the flood. The second king is Enmengalana. Here Gal replaces Lu. Gal means great, large, supreme. Enmengalana is thus Lord of the Great Heavenly Crown, or Lord of the Crown, Great One of Heaven, a title with somewhat more overtly divine connotations than his predecessor. He ruled for 28,800 years, the number that appears in the video title, and the number that anchors this evening's investigation. His paired sage in the Uruk tradition is Enmegalama, whose name similarly contains Gal, suggesting a deliberate thematic mirroring between king and sage. The paired titles of Bad-tibira's first 2 kings suggest a progression, from the Man of Heaven to the Great One of Heaven. One reading of this progression is purely formulaic, scribal convention for indicating senior and junior positions in a hierarchy. Another reading notices that the progression moves from the human-tinged to the more purely divine arc, as if the kingship of Bad-tibira was tracking a movement from something closer to human towards something closer to divine over the course of those combined 72,000 years. And then comes the third king, and everything changes register. Dumuzid the Shepherd. The text does not call him N something something. It gives him a name that appears in dozens of Sumerian literary texts, hymns, lamentations and mythological narratives, and it gives him an epithet, Sipad, shepherd, that is simultaneously a practical profession and one of the central metaphorical frameworks of Sumerian kingship. Every legitimate Sumerian king was described as a shepherd. The gods appointed shepherd kings to tend the human flock the way real shepherds tended their animals, with care, with responsibility, with seasonal attentiveness. Calling Dumuzi the Shepherd is therefore not merely describing his occupation. It is using the full weight of Sumerian royal ideology. But Dumuzi, or Dumuzid, to give his Sumerian name its fuller form, is not primarily a king in Sumerian culture. He is a god, the 3rd and 4th most elaborately documented deity in the Sumerian literary corpus after Inanna and Enki. He appears in the sacred marriage hymns as Inanna's divine consort, the shepherd king whose union with the Queen of Heaven guarantees the fertility of the land and the prosperity of the city. He appears in the descent narrative as the figure taken to the underworld in Inanna's place, condemned to spend half of each year in the realm of death, returning in spring, dying again in summer, his annual passage explaining the cycle of vegetation in Mesopotamia's brutal climate. He appears in lament texts of extraordinary emotional depth, as the murdered young god whose body the rivers carry to the sea. This Dumuzi, whose death was mourned in formal ritual weeping, whose return was celebrated with festival, whose story was told and retold across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian literature, is also listed as the 3rd pre-flood king of Bad-tibira. The Sumerian King List does not offer any explanation for this. It does not say this is the god Dumuzi, here in his earthly form. It does not distinguish his entry from those of Enmenluana and Enmengalana. It simply places his name in the sequence, notes his 36,000-year reign, notes his epithet, and moves on. There is one further detail that sharpens the anomaly. In the post-flood section of the scale, the historical dynasties after the flood swept over, there appears another Dumuzi. This post-flood Dumuzi is the fisherman, a different epithet, listed as a king of Uruk. He too is a historical figure of uncertain historicity, but he belongs to the recoverable human past rather than the pre-flood cosmic era. 2 Dumuzis in the king list, one the shepherd of Bad-tibira before the flood, one the fisherman of Uruk after it. The repetition of the name across the flood boundary does not appear to be coincidental. Something in the Sumerian tradition insisted that Dumuzi, this specific divine figure, had a presence on both sides of the Great Catastrophe. Whether the pre-flood Dumuzi of Bad-tibira represents a historical king who was later divinized, a deity whose mythological connection to Bad-tibira predates the skill, or a deliberate scribal decision to anchor the cosmic shepherd king figure in the text's earliest stratum, all three. Possibilities remain live, and none is definitively excluded by the evidence we have. What is not in doubt is the specific combination, a city named for metalworkers, ruled for over 100,000 years by two divinely titled lords and one explicitly named god, before the flood came and the kingship passed on. This combination is too specific, too internally consistent to be random. The mathematics of eternity. There is a way to look at the numbers of the Sumerian King List that most popular accounts skip over entirely, and it is, in some ways, the most revealing angle of investigation available to us. The Sumerians did not count the way we do. Their fundamental mathematical system, the one they used for everything from grain rations to astronomical cycles to rural rain lengths, was not base 10, it was base 60. The sexagesimal system, as modern mathematicians call it, treats 60 as its primary base unit rather than 10. We still live inside this system every time we read a clock, 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour. We live inside it every time we consult a compass, 360 degrees in a circle, a number that is 6 times 60. We live inside it every time an astronomer divides the sky into arc seconds. These conventions are not accidents. They are inheritances from Sumer, transmitted through Babylonian and Greek astronomy into the modern world, where they persist 4,000 years after the last Sumerian speaker died. Within the Sumerian sexagesimal system, three large units are particularly important for understanding the antediluvian rains. The Sos is 60, the Ner is 600, and the Sar, the most significant for our purposes, is 3,600. The word Sar also means totality, universe, the complete number, and was used to refer to the full count of something. It is 60 squared, 60 times 60. In the Sumerian cosmological imagination, 3,600 was not merely a large number. It was a number that carried connotations of completeness and cosmic order. Now look at the antediluvian reigns of Badtibira's three kings through this lens. Amenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Expressed in Sar units, 43,200 divided by 3,600 equals exactly 12. 12 Sar. Amengol-Anna ruled for 28,800 years. Expressed in Sar units, 28,800 divided by 3,600 equals exactly 8. 8 Sar. Dumuzid ruled for 36,000 years. Expressed in Sar units, 36,000 divided by 3,600 equals exactly 10. 10 Sar. Total for Bad-tibira, 12 plus 8 plus 10 times equals 30 Sar. 30 complete cycles of 3,600, or 33,600 plus 108,000. Every single antediluvian reign in the scale is an exact multiple of 3,600. There are no remainders, no fractions, no awkward half-Sar residuals. The 8 kings of 5 cities total 241,200 years, which is 67 Sar plus 1 additional 600-year Ner. The numbers are not merely rounded, they are structured, precisely and internally consistently within a specific mathematical framework. This observation was noted by several scholars before the late 20th century, but a rigorous mathematical investigation was undertaken by Dwight W. Young, whose work appeared in the Journal of Biblical Literature in 1988. Young examined not only the antediluvian reigns, but the patterns in the post-flood dynasties as well, and found that the Gutian dynasty's reigns, almost all clustered around 5, 6 or 7 years, followed a pattern consistent with what the scholar Roten had previously identified as artificial round, numbers in the sexagesimal system. The structural use of base 60 numbers throughout the skill strongly suggests that the scribes were working within a mathematical framework that imposed order on the data rather than simply recording durations as they found them. But what kind of mathematical framework, and what was it encoding? One possibility, favoured by Jacobson and many mainstream scholars is that the framework is purely conventional, a scribal tradition of using dignified, large, mathematically elegant numbers to honour the greatness of ancient rulers. On this reading, 8 Sar for Enmengalana is not a calculation of anything astronomical or calendrical. It is the scribal equivalent of saying he ruled for a very, very long time in a culture that expressed very long times in multiples of 3600. A second possibility, proposed by various researchers across the 20th century, is that the numbers encode astronomical cycles. The precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis that causes the position of the equinox to drift across the zodiac over approximately 25,920 years, was known to ancient Babylonian astronomers, and there is evidence that earlier Mesopotamian traditions preserved astronomical observations of remarkable precision. The number 43,200 is exactly 5/3 of 25,920, the precessional year. The number 36,000 is approximately 1.39 times the precessional year. The total 241,200 is exactly 9.3 precessional cycles. Whether these relationships are deliberate encoded references or coincidental products of a shared mathematical base is a question that cannot be settled without additional evidence. But the structural relationship between Sumerian sexagesimal numbers and precessional astronomy is real and has been noted by multiple independent researchers. A third possibility, perhaps the most intriguing and the least provable, is that the numbers preserve the memory of a genuine chronological tradition, not a record of individual human lifespans, but a record of dynastic periods, eras during which a particular city held regional dominance, counted in the large round units appropriate to cosmic time. If Bad-tibira held a form of regional centrality for something in the range of several centuries before a catastrophic flood that reorganised Mesopotamian settlement patterns, the scribes who later compiled the Antediluvian section might have expressed that duration in Sar units, cosmologically appropriate large number format, rather than in ordinary years. This reading is speculative, but it is worth noting that the archaeologist Robert McCormick Adams, whose surveys of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain in the 1960s and 1970s established the basic framework for understanding prehistoric settlement patterns in the region, identified significant disruptions in settlement. Continuity during the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, disruptions consistent with major flooding events or dramatic hydrological reorganisation of the river system. Bad-tibira's location on the Iturungal Canal placed it in precisely the region most vulnerable to such disruptions. What the antediluvian numbers mean cannot be definitively established with current evidence, but what they are is clear: a mathematically structured system internally consistent using the largest unit in the Sumerian numerical repertoire to express the duration of pre-flood kingship. They were not chosen randomly. They were not poetic exaggeration in any loose sense of that phrase. They were constructed precisely, deliberately, within a specific mathematical tradition, and they were preserved, unchanged, across multiple independent manuscript traditions for at least 500 years. Something was being remembered. The structure of the remembering was intentional. The god who was also king. To understand why Dumuzi's appearance as the last pre-flood king of Bad-tibira is so remarkable, you have to hold two different images of the same figure simultaneously in mind. The first image, Dumuzi in the mythological texts. He is young, beautiful, and doomed. He is the shepherd who tends his flocks on the steppe, who wears fine garments when the season allows, who plays the reed pipe in the evenings, whose hair smells of cedar. He is the chosen consort of Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, a match that the mythological texts describe with a combination of erotic energy and cosmic significance, because the union of the shepherd king and the goddess of love and war is not merely a romantic arrangement. It is the mechanism by which fertility, abundance, and civilizational prosperity flow from the divine realm into the human one. The hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, was not merely a myth. It was a ritual performed in Sumerian temples in which the king embodied Dumuzi and, through his union with the goddess, possibly represented by her high priestess or by the goddess's own divine presence, renewed the world's capacity for life. Then Inanna descends to the underworld and everything changes. She enters the realm of the dead, passes through its 7 gates, loses a piece of her divine power at each threshold, and is finally reduced to a corpse hanging on a peg in the throne room of Eresh-Gigol, her sister and the queen of the dead. She is rescued, but she cannot leave without sending a substitute. The demons who accompany her back to the surface are looking for a replacement soul. They travel through the Sumerian cities, and at each one they find a figure who has been mourning Inanna's absence, dressed in sackcloth, prostrate, performing the appropriate rites of grief. They spare these figures, but in Uruk they find Dumuzi sitting on his magnificent throne, dressed in splendour, apparently indifferent to Inanna's fate. Whether this is hubris or a performance of royal dignity or something else entirely, the text does not explain. The demons take him. Dumuzi is dragged to the underworld. He escapes briefly, is recaptured, escapes again, is hidden by the gods of the steppe, is caught a final time. He strikes a bargain. He will spend half the year in the realm of the dead, and his sister Geshtinanna will spend the other half in his place. This alternation, Dumuzi's descent and return, Geshtinanna's reciprocal sacrifice, maps onto the cycle of seasons in Mesopotamia, where the summer heat kills the vegetation and the autumn rains bring it back. Every year the world died and returned. Every year the mourning rites for Dumuzi were performed in Sumerian temples. Every year his resurrection was celebrated. Now hold the second image, Dumuzi in the Sumerian King List. He is listed between Enmengalana and the flood narrative, given a number of years and an epithet, and moved past with no more ceremony than any other ruler. The text does not call him a god. It does not call him a mythological figure. It gives him the same grammatical structure as every other king in the pre-flood and post-flood sections. In the Economy of the Scales prose, Dumuzi the Shepherd of Bad-tibira is simply a king who held the mandate of heaven for 36,000 years. The collision between these two images, the dying and rising vegetation deity and the administrative entry in a king list, is not accidental and cannot be tidied away. One framework for understanding it is the concept of euhemerism, the theory, named for the Greek writer Euhemerus 300 BC, that the gods of mythology were originally historical humans who were divinized after their deaths. On this reading, there was a historical king of Bad-tibira, perhaps a particularly charismatic or powerful ruler, perhaps the founder of the city's metallurgical tradition, perhaps someone who established the agricultural calendar that the city's economy depended on, and over generations the memory of this ruler was elaborated and mythologized until he became Dumuzi the god, the dying shepherd, the consort of heaven. The skill in preserving his name as a pre-flood king preserved a faint echo of the historical original. Euhemerism is a real and useful analytical tool, and it is not impossible that a historical memory of an early ruler underlies the Dumuzi mythology. But as an explanation, it runs into difficulties. The Dumuzi mythology is so extensively developed, so deeply woven into the cosmological and ritual fabric of Sumerian civilization, that explaining it as the deification of a historical king requires that historical king to have been of almost unimaginable cultural significance. Moreover, the mythology's connection to agricultural cycles and celestial patterns, the half-year in the underworld, the return in spring, the connection to the disappearance and reappearance of certain stars, suggests origins in something older than any specific historical ruler. A second framework treats the scale's inclusion of Dumuzi as a theological statement rather than a historical one. By placing a god in the sequence of pre-flood kings, the scribes were asserting that the divine order and the political order were not merely parallel but identical, that the Nam-Lugal, the kingship that descended from heaven, was so deeply continuous with divine reality that one of its holders was a god himself. Bad-tibira's kingship was not merely divinely sanctioned, it was, at its culmination, literally divine. A third framework, perhaps the most intellectually interesting, notices that Dumuzi's specific qualities as a deity map remarkably precisely onto the economic and symbolic identity of Badtibira itself. Dumuzi is the shepherd. Badtibira is the city of metalworkers. Shepherding and metallurgy are both activities that require seasonal movement, specialised knowledge, the management of heat and fire, and a specific relationship with the non-human world, animals in one case, ore and flame in the other. The city of the copperworkers chose as its divine patron, and as its final pre-flood king, the god whose domain encompassed the hinge between the natural and the civilised, the raw and the worked, the living and the dead. There is a coherence here that goes beyond coincidence. Dumuzi at Badtibira is not a random assignment. He is the appropriate figure for this specific city at this specific moment in the text, on the threshold of the flood that will destroy and reset the world. The annual cycle of his death and return encodes something about civilizational continuity. What is lost may be recovered. What descends may ascend. The flood that will come at the end of Bad-tibira's era is not the end of the story. It is Dumuzi's descent into the underworld, written at civilizational scale. Other voices before the flood. The Sumerian King List does not stand alone in preserving the tradition of pre-flood kingship and cosmic catastrophe. What makes the tradition significant, what elevates it from a single unusual document to a pattern worthy of sustained investigation, is the number of independent sources that converge on the same basic framework, from different genres, different periods, and different cultural contexts. The oldest of these independent sources is a fragmentary Sumerian tablet held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia. Its catalogue number is CBS 100673, and it is one of the most extraordinary objects in that extraordinary collection. It was excavated at Nippur during the third season of the University of Pennsylvania's expedition, conducted between 1893 and 1896. The tablet dates to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1600 BC, and it contains what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian creation and flood narrative. The Eridu Genesis is damaged. Roughly 2/3 of the original tablet is missing, broken away over the millennia, and what survives is fragmentary enough that whole sections of the narrative remain unclear. But what does survive is unmistakable. The text begins with the creation of animals and grain, the founding of cities, and the institution of kingship. The opening lines, as translated by Thorkild Jacobson in 1981, describe how the black-headed people were given the arts of civilization, including, crucially, the me, the divine powers. Then the text turns to the flood, and it gives, before describing the catastrophe, a brief list of antediluvian cities. The cities named include Eridu and Shuruppak, 2 of the 5 cities in the Scales Antediluvian section. The text describes kingship being lowered from heaven, and then after the flood, the same phrase, after the flood had swept over, kingship descended again. The structural parallel with the Scale is not coincidental. Both texts operate within the same cosmological framework, a primordial era of divinely granted kingship, a flood as civilizational rupture, a second descent of kingship after the catastrophe. The Eridu Genesis is not a copy of the Scale, and the Scale is not a copy of the Eridu Genesis. They are independent witnesses to a shared tradition. The tradition itself is older than both. The Atrahasis epic takes a different approach to the same material. This 18th century BC Akkadian composition, preserved on multiple tablets, primarily in the British Museum's collections, tells the story of the flood from the perspective of the god's decision-making. The god Enlil is disturbed by the noise of humanity. The text says, the earth was bellowing like a bull with the clamour of overpopulation, and he resolves to destroy the human race entirely. He tries famine, then plague, then drought. Each time the god Enki intervenes and teaches Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, how to avert the catastrophe. Finally, Enlil decides on a flood, and Enki, in a famous scene, speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house rather than to the man himself, thus technically not violating his oath not to warn humanity, while still ensuring that the knowledge reaches its intended recipient. The Atrahasis epic does not list antediluvian kings, but it establishes the cosmological framework within which the King List's pre-flood section operates. The flood in this tradition is not a random natural disaster, it is a decision made by the gods, a deliberate act of cosmic restructuring. Humanity before the flood and humanity after the flood are not continuous in the normal way. There is a rupture, an annihilation, and a reconstitution. The world after the flood is a restored world, not a continuous one. This matters for how we read the Scale's Antediluvian section. If the flood represents a genuine civilizational rupture in Mesopotamian cultural memory, whether as a literal historical event or as a mythological framing of some real catastrophic disruption, then the pre-flood kings are not merely ancient kings. They are inhabitants of a different world. The 108,000 years of Bad-tibira's antediluvian monarchy are not part of the same historical continuum as Sargon of Akkad's 56-year reign. They belong to a different category of time entirely. The most distant independent witness to the antediluvian king tradition comes from the Babylonian priest Berossus, who lived in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC during the Hellenistic period following Alexander's conquest of Persia. Around 290 BC, Berossus composed a 3-volume history of Babylon in Greek, intended for his Macedonian rulers, called the Babyloniaca. The original is lost, but substantial fragments survive quoted in later authors, Eusebius, Alexander Polyhistor, Syncellus. In these fragments, Berossus records a list of 10 antediluvian kings who ruled before the flood, with reigns measured in sars, though expressed in their Greek equivalents as years in the surviving text. His final pre-flood king is Xisuthros, a Greek rendering of the Sumerian Ziusudra, the flood hero, who in the Sumerian tradition is the king of Shuruppak at the time the flood struck. Berossus has 10 kings, where the scale has 8. The reign lengths differ, the city assignments differ in several cases, but the structure is unmistakable, an antediluvian era of enormously long reigning kings, a flood sent by the gods, a hero who survives and transmits knowledge to the post-flood world. Berossus, writing in Greek for a Hellenistic audience nearly 15 centuries after the Weld-Blundell Prism was fired, was still drawing on the same well. This is the most important point about the flood and antediluvian tradition: it survived. It was not a marginal text, not an obscure curiosity, not a document that required archaeological excavation to rediscover. It was transmitted continuously, maintained actively, updated and retold across the full span of Mesopotamian civilization from the Year 3 period through the Hellenistic age. Cultures do not maintain traditions for 2,000 years unless those traditions are doing important work, carrying something that needs to be carried, preserving something that matters, answering questions that keep being asked. What question was the antediluvian tradition answering? That is perhaps the deepest question in this investigation. And the fact that Bad-tibira occupies the second position in that tradition, that it was the city to receive kingship after the first city, before the shepherd god held its throne and the flood came, suggests that whatever question the tradition was answering, Bad-tibira was central to the answer. The silence of the spade. Archaeology is sometimes most eloquent about the past when it finds evidence of catastrophe. The flood deposits at excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1927 and 1929 during his landmark season in the Royal Cemetery, remain one of the most debated stratigraphic findings in Mesopotamian archaeology. Woolley digging through layers of occupation debris below the raw cemetery, encountered a stratum of clean water-deposited silt roughly 2.5 metres thick. Below it, more occupation material. Above it, more occupation material. The stratum itself contained nothing. No artefacts, no pottery, no animal bones, just clean alluvial silt, the kind deposited by standing water over a period of time. Woolley announced that he had found evidence of the biblical flood. The claim attracted enormous attention and considerable scholarly scepticism. What the deposit actually indicates is a significant local flooding event, significant enough to interrupt occupation at Ur for a period, significant enough to deposit metres of silt before human activity resumed. Whether this specific event corresponds to the Mesopotamian flood tradition, and whether it affected all 5 antediluvian cities simultaneously, remains unresolved. Similar flood deposits have been identified at Shuruppak-Phra, at Kish, and at other Mesopotamian sites, but they do not all date to the same period, suggesting multiple major flooding episodes rather than a single universal event. What is consistent across these sites is the evidence for dramatic, periodically catastrophic hydrological instability in southern Mesopotamia throughout the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The river system was not stable. The Euphrates and Tigris shifted their courses. Canals that sustained cities could silt up or be cut off by new river channels. Cities that had been agricultural centres for centuries could find themselves suddenly landlocked and dying, while new settlements rose along shifted watercourses. Robert McCormick Adams and Hans Nissen's 1972 survey of the Europe countryside mapped settlement patterns across the alluvial plain and found evidence of precisely this kind of dramatic settlement discontinuity, periods of flourishing followed by abandonment, followed by re-establishment, sometimes at the same site, sometimes at a new one nearby. Bad-tibira, Tel al-Madineh, sits in this landscape. Its position on the Iturungal Canal connected it to the hydraulic network of central Sumer, and that position was simultaneously its lifeblood and its vulnerability. The canal inscription of Ornamu, recording the digging or restoration of the Iturungal Canal around 2100 BC, implies that the canal required active maintenance and was not a permanent, self-sustaining feature of the landscape. Canals need to be dug, dredged, monitored, and repaired. A city dependent on a canal that silted or shifted could cease to exist within a generation. The site itself, as reported by Doherty in 1927, shows evidence of destruction by fire. Vitrified brick fused by extreme heat, scattered across the surface of the main mound, is the archaeological signature of a city that burned, not merely one that was gradually abandoned. Something violent ended Bad-tibira, and the surface pottery noted by Crawford in 1965, indicating occupation until approximately 1500 BC, combined with the absence of Neo-Babylonian or later period remains, suggests that the city was not merely depopulated, but permanently abandoned sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. After that point, it simply ceases to be. The irony is significant. The city that the Sumerian King List places second in the Antediluvian cosmic order, the city that held the divine mandate of kingship through a shepherd god before the Great Flood, has itself been effectively erased by time and circumstance. Its mound exists. Its inscriptions survive in museums around the world, referenced in academic publications, recorded in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. But the city beneath the mound, with all its layers of occupation, its temple foundations, its archive rooms, its metallurgical installations, has never been systematically excavated. This absence is not merely a logistical problem, it is a genuine intellectual lacuna. In the absence of excavation data from Bad-tibira itself, every claim about the city's pre-flood history must be built on evidence from other sources, textual references, comparative material from nearby sites, surface survey data, and the structural logic of the King List tradition. We cannot confirm or deny the existence of a significant early dynastic settlement at Tel al-Madineh because no one has dug deep enough to find it. The vitrified brick on the surface speaks of a city that burned. The foundation deposits of Entemena and Ur-Nammu speak of a city with functioning temples and hydraulic infrastructure in the 3rd millennium BC. The early dynastic copper figurine found in 2017 hints at an occupation layer consistent with the period the scale's Antediluvian tradition claims. But the spade has not spoken, and in the world of ancient Near Eastern archaeology, the spade's silence is not the same as a denial. The most significant unexcavated tell in this region of southern Iraq may be sitting directly on the location where the Sumerian cosmological tradition says the world's second kingship was established before the flood. Until it is properly excavated, a project that will require political stability in Iraq, international scholarly cooperation, and substantial funding, the question of what physical reality the antediluvian tradition of Badtibira reflects will remain genuinely, honestly open. That openness is not a weakness in the investigation. It is the investigation's most honest position. The absent King List. There is an anomaly in the manuscript tradition of the Sumerian King List that receives less popular attention than the impossible reign lengths, but which may be more intellectually significant than any individual number. It is, in essence, an absence. The oldest known version of the scale does not contain the antediluvian section at all. The text known as the Earthly Sumerian King List, abbreviated Uskal in the scholarly literature, is our earliest surviving version of the composition. Its colophon, the scribal notation at the end of the text, states that it was copied during the reign of Shulgi of Ur. Shulgi ruled from approximately 2094 to 2047 BC, making this version of the scale somewhere between 250 and 300 years older than the Weld-Blundell Prism. The tablet may have been found at Adab, though its precise provenance is uncertain. The Uskal begins with a line now familiar from other versions. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Then it proceeds with the first dynasty of Kish. The 5 antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larag, Zimbir, Shuruppak, are simply absent. The 8 pre-flood kings do not appear. The Great Flood is not mentioned. The text moves directly from the divine descent of kingship to its first earthly recipient, Kish, and then through the historical dynasties in a sequence recognizable from the later, longer versions. Why does this matter? Because the Uskal structure suggests that the original form of the King List tradition, the version that existed during the politically powerful Earthly dynasty under one of its most accomplished rulers, did not include the antediluvian material. Whatever the source of the 8 pre-flood kings and 5 pre-flood cities, that material entered the scale tradition after the Year 3 period. Pieter Steinkeller's argument about why this happened is compelling. The Year 3 state collapsed around 2004 BC, destroyed by a combination of internal administrative failure and military pressure from the Elamites and Amorites. The period following the collapse, the Isin-Lhasa period, from which the Weld-Blundell Prism dates, was one of intense political fragmentation and competition. Multiple city-states claimed the legitimate inheritance of Ur-3's authority. The scale became a tool in this competition. By possessing the most comprehensive and cosmologically authoritative version of the King List, a city-state could claim to be the rightful heir to the mandate of heaven. In this context, adding a pre-flood section to the scale served a specific political purpose. The original list began with Kish as the first recipient of kingship. This gave Kish, and by extension, dynasties that claimed descent from or connection to Kish, a privileged cosmic status as the first post-divine settlement. By inserting 5 antediluvian cities before the flood, later redactors could relativize Kish's status. Yes, Kish was first after the flood, but the flood itself was a reset, and what mattered for cosmic authority was not the post-flood first city, but the pattern of divine kingship as a whole, which ran through many cities before and after the catastrophe. This is a coherent argument for the political function of the insertion. But as noted earlier, the function of inserting material does not explain the content of what was inserted. You insert material that exists, that is already circulating, already known, already carrying cultural authority. The antediluvian tradition of the 5 cities and 8 kings was not invented at the Isin Lhasa scribal schools. It was drawn from something older. One indication of this is the internal consistency of the antediluvian tradition across multiple independent sources. The Eridu Genesis, CBS 10673, Penn Museum, knows about pre-flood cities without using the same city list as the Skell, but overlapping with it. Berossus, writing from Babylon in the 3rd century BC, knows 10 antediluvian kings with reign lengths expressed in Sar units, a tradition that must have been maintained independently of the specific Weld-Blundell Prism lineage for over a millennium. The Uruk list of kings and sages, a different Mesopotamian text that pairs antediluvian kings with Apkallu sages, provides the names of Enmen-Luana and Enmen-Golan as companion sages, confirming their existence in a separate textual tradition. The MS-2T855 tablet in the Shine collection, a privately held cuneiform tablet in the Martin Shine collection, documented in the collection's published catalogue, contains a version of the Antediluvian King List that provides independent attestation of the tradition without being a copy of. The Weld-Blundell Prism. Multiple textual witnesses, multiple traditions, converging on the same basic structure, 5 cities, pre-flood kings with Sar-based reigns, a flood that ends the era, kingship reconstituted in a post-flood world. What this convergence suggests is not that the antediluvian tradition was invented at a specific moment for a specific political purpose. Rather, the tradition had a life of its own, circulating in Mesopotamian culture in various forms, and was incorporated into the Skell tradition at a specific moment because it was already available, already authoritative, already culturally resonant. The Isin Lhasa redactors did not create the material. They preserved it in a new context, and the tradition they preserved, whatever its ultimate source, placed Bad-tibira at the second position in the antediluvian cosmic order, gave it 3 rulers, whose mathematical encoding is both precise and non-random, and ended its pre-flood dynasty with a god whose mythology was still being. Actively maintained in Sumerian temple ritual at the time the Weld-Blundell Prism was fired. The oldest version of the list doesn't have this section, but every version of the list that does have it agrees on Bad-tibira. 3 ways of reading impossible time. We have now gathered evidence from multiple directions: the physical object of the prism, the geography of Tel al-Madineh, the linguistic structure of the 3 kings' names, the mathematical precision of the reign lengths, the mythology of Dumuzi, the independent attestation of the flood tradition in the Eridu Genesis and Atrahasis, the manuscript anomaly of the Uskul, the political context of the Isin Lhasa redaction. It is time to lay the 3 major interpretive frameworks alongside each other, give each its full due, and acknowledge honestly what each one cannot explain. The first framework is the purely literary and political interpretation. On this reading, the antediluvian section of the Skell is a literary composition created or assembled during the Isin Lhasa period to serve the political legitimation needs of competing city-states. The 5 pre-flood cities are not a historical record, but a curated selection from Sumerian mythological tradition, chosen because they were already prestigious in the cultural imagination. The reign lengths are mathematically structured large numbers, numerically impressive, cosmologically authoritative, but not encoding any specific historical or astronomical information. Dumuzi's presence as a king is a theological statement about the divine nature of pre-flood kingship, not a claim about a historical ruler. The flood itself is a mythological motif, a narrative device marking the boundary between primordial and historical time that need not correspond to any specific geological event. This interpretation has the strongest claim to mainstream scholarly consensus. Van der Meeroop's cautionary approach, Steinkeller's political analysis, and the broader trend in recent Mesopotamian scholarship toward treating the skull as a literary artifact rather than a historical document all support it. It is intellectually rigorous and appropriately sceptical. What it cannot fully explain is why the antediluvian tradition is so internally consistent across independent sources that were not derived from each other, why the mathematical structure of the reign lengths is so precise and systematic, and why specifically these 5 cities, with their specific geographic clustering in southern Mesopotamia, were selected as the pre-flood recipients of heavenly kingship rather than other equally prestigious Sumerian cities. The second framework is the encoded knowledge interpretation. On this reading, the reign lengths in the antediluvian section are not historical durations but numerical encodings of astronomical, calendrical, or cosmological information expressed in SAR units because SAR 3600 was the Sumerian number for cosmic completeness, and because the sexagesimal system was the numerical language of Mesopotamian astronomy. The pre-flood tradition, on this reading, is a vehicle for preserving and transmitting mathematically structured knowledge across generations, using the culturally authoritative format of a royal chronicle as its container. The specific figures, 43,200, 28,800, 36,000, encode relationships to astronomical cycles that Mesopotamian astronomers tracked, possibly including the precession of the equinoxes and the Venus cycle. This interpretation has genuine mathematical support. The relationship between the antediluvian numbers and the sexagesimal system is undeniable. The relationship between those numbers and precessional astronomy, while not conclusive, is real enough that multiple independent researchers have noted it. What this interpretation cannot easily explain is why astronomical data would be encoded specifically as King List entries, as if the most natural container for astronomical knowledge was a list of rulers and their reigns, and why the tradition insists on specific city names and personal names, including the theologically complex figure of Dumuzi, if the real content is numerical rather than historical. The third framework is the preserved memory interpretation. This reading takes the antediluvian tradition most seriously as a record, not a literal administrative record of individual reigns, but a structured cultural memory of a real pre-flood era in Mesopotamian history. On this reading, the 5 cities represent a genuine tradition about the settlement geography of southern Mesopotamia before a major flooding event or sequence of events that dramatically reorganised the alluvial plain. The reign lengths are expressed in SAR units because that is the appropriate format for encoding very long periods of time in the Sumerian numerical system, just as we might express geological periods in millions of years without meaning that specific events took precisely that long. The specific number of SAR assigned to each reign reflects a relative sense of each city's pre-flood prominence rather than a literal count of calendar years. Dumuzi's presence as Bad-tibira's final pre-flood king reflects a genuine tradition, perhaps a very ancient one, about the theological and political character of that city in the era before the flood. This interpretation is speculative in ways the other two are not. It requires that the Sumerians preserved a genuine cultural memory across a time period, from whenever the flood occurred to whenever the antediluvian section was composed. That may span centuries or millennia. It requires that the tradition was transmitted in a form stable enough to preserve specific city names, specific king names, and specific numerical structures across that span. These are not impossible requirements. Oral traditions in other cultures have demonstrated remarkable stability over comparable time periods. The Vedic tradition of India preserved extraordinarily detailed texts orally for over a millennium before they were written down. The traditions of indigenous Australians have preserved detailed accounts of geological events, coastal inundations, volcanic eruptions, with surprising accuracy over thousands of years. None of these parallels prove anything about the Sumerian Antediluvian tradition, but they establish that long-term transmission of specific structured cultural memory is not impossible, and the internal consistency of the Sumerian flood tradition across multiple independent sources, the Skell, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis, Berossus, suggests that something coherent and stable was being transmitted, not merely reinvented by each generation. The three frameworks are not mutually exclusive. A tradition can serve political purposes and encode astronomical knowledge and preserve historical memory simultaneously. Human cultures routinely do all three things with the same texts. The question is not which framework is the correct one, but which combination of functions best accounts for all the evidence, including the evidence that each single framework interpretation struggles to explain. That question remains open. It has been open for over a century of serious scholarship. It is unlikely to be closed without the excavation of Tel al-Madineh and the discovery of the kind of early dynastic archive that could either confirm or deny a pre-flood occupation layer beneath the flood deposits. Until that day, the three frameworks sit alongside each other, each illuminating a different face of the prism, what Bad-tibira remembers. There is a pattern in the way the Sumerian King List treats Bad-tibira that becomes visible only when you step back far enough to see the entire Antediluvian section as a single composition. The first city, Eridu, receives kingship first. Eridu was the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, the city founded at the edge of the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that was Enki's domain. Its archaeological remains at Tel Abu Shirain in modern Iraq represent some of the earliest settlement evidence in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to approximately 5400 BC. In the Sumerian cosmological imagination, Eridu was the beginning of civilization itself. Its two pre-flood kings, Alulim with 28,800 years and Al-Awjar with 36,000 years, hold the tradition's starting point. Then Eridu falls, and the kingship passes to Bad-tibira. Second, not third, not fourth, second in the cosmic sequence, immediately after the origin point. Whatever Bad-tibira represented in the Sumerian cultural imagination, it was important enough to occupy the position immediately after civilization's founding city. The three cities that follow, Lurug, Zimbir and Shuruppak, are each given only a single king and a single reign. Lurug in Sipad-Zidana, 28,800 years, Zimbir in Men-Durana, 21,000 years, Shuruppak Ubaratutu, 18,600 years, single rulers, diminishing reign lengths, a sequence that feels like a fading, a tapering off as the flood approaches. Bad-tibira alone receives three kings, three separate figures, three separate reigns, 108,000 total years, the largest aggregate of any antediluvian city, including Eridu, which totals only 64,800 years across its two kings. Bad-tibira is given more kings and more years than any other city in the pre-flood section. By any measure of internal textual emphasis, Bad-tibira is the central city of the antediluvian era. Why? The text does not say, but the pattern itself is a kind of argument. Whatever the tradition was preserving about the pre-flood world, it centred on Bad-tibira, and the specific content of Bad-tibira's kings, two divinely titled lord figures, and then, at the climax, the shepherd god himself, suggests that the tradition was not merely listing rulers, but building towards something. The progression from Enmen-Lu-Anna to Enmen-Gal-Anna, Great One of Hever, to Dumuzi the Shepherd, traces an ascent toward the divine, culminating in a deity on the throne immediately before the flood. The copperworking identity of the city carries its own implications in this context. Metallurgy in ancient Mesopotamia was not merely an economic activity, it was a sacred one. The transformation of raw ore into metal, the application of fire and skill to produce something with properties radically different from its components, was understood as a form of creative power analogous to the god's own creative acts. In later Mesopotamian tradition, the craft of the smith was protected by specific deities, and governed by specific ritual requirements. Metalworkers occupied a distinctive social position, essential, specialised, somewhat separate from the agricultural society around them. A city named for its copper workers, holding the divine mandate of kingship for the longest period of any antediluvian city, culminating in the reign of a deity associated with the cycle of death and renewal, this is a coherent symbolic composition, whatever its historical substrate. It says something about how the Sumerians understood the relationship between technological knowledge, divine authority, and the preservation of civilization across catastrophic rupture. Dumuzi dies and returns. The flood comes and the world is rebuilt. Metallurgical knowledge, embedded in the identity of Bad-tibira, protected perhaps in the city's institutional memory, must also survive the rupture and be available to the post-flood world. The Apkallis, the antediluvian sages paired with the pre-flood kings in the Uruk list of kings and sages, were described in later Mesopotamian tradition as the teachers of civilization's arts. They brought the knowledge of building, writing, ritual, and craft from the pre-flood world into the post-flood one. Each antediluvian king had his paired sage. Bad-tibira's three kings had theirs: Enmeduga for Enmenluana, Enmegalama for Enmengalana, and Enlilda for Dumuzi. The knowledge survived. That is what the tradition insists. The flood destroyed the world, but not its knowledge. The Nam Lugal descended from heaven again and settled in Kish, and civilization resumed. But the knowledge that made civilization possible, the crafts, the rituals, the astronomical observations, the agricultural calendar, the metallurgical techniques, was carried across the flood boundary by figures whose names the tradition preserved. Whether this preservation was literal or metaphorical, whether the flood was a single event or a series of disruptions, whether Bad-tibira was a real pre-flood centre or a mythological designation, the insistence on preservation and continuity is the tradition's deepest argument. The Sumerians who compiled and transmitted this material were not primarily interested in celebrating a lost past. They were interested in demonstrating that the past was not entirely lost. That knowledge, once given, persists, that the Nam Lugal, kingship, civilization, the divine mandate to organise human life into something larger than subsistence, is not fragile. It survives floods. It returns from the underworld. It descends from heaven again when necessary. Bad-tibira, in the end, may be remembered not because of what it was, but because of what it represents. The second city, the city of makers, the city whose last king was the dying god who always came back. The prism turns. Return to Oxford, return to the Ashmolean Museum, to the gallery where the Weld-Blundell Prism sits in its display case, pale clay and cuneiform columns, 20 centimetres tall. A scribe sat down around 1800 BC and pressed the wedges into soft clay that would be fired and last, as clay tablets last, almost indefinitely, not despite being buried in the ground, but because of it. He worked from older sources, other tablets, lists maintained in temple archives through multiple copying generations. He was not, in the sense we mean when we use the word, an author. He was a transmitter. His job was fidelity, to preserve what he had received in a form that would survive to be received again. He pressed into the prism in Bad-tibira. Enmenluana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmengalana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid the Shepherd ruled for 36,000 years. Three kings, they ruled for 108,000 years. Then Bad-tibira fell and the kingship was taken to Larag. He did not explain it, he did not defend it or apologise for it or frame it with cautionary notes about metaphorical interpretation. He wrote it as he received it, in the same format as every other entry in the list. The King List begins with heaven and ends with history, and somewhere in between, at the second city, a shepherd god held the throne for 10 complete cycles of 3,600 years, and then the flood came, and then the world began again. The mound at Tel al-Madineh sits in the Iraqi dust, unexcavated, its deeper layers holding whatever the physical record of Bad-tibira contains. Satellite images show it pocked with looters' pits. Surface pottery scattered across it speaks of centuries of human presence. Somewhere beneath the vitrified brick of its burning and the baked brick inscription of Amar-Sin and the foundation cone of Entemena and the deeper early dynastic layers that have never been reached by a scientific spade, somewhere in that stratigraphy there may be information that would change the conversation, or there may not. Absence is also a finding. What we are left with is the prism and the tradition it contains, and the questions that tradition generates and does not resolve. 3 kings, one god among them, mathematical precision that goes beyond narrative convention, a city name for metalworkers, holding the cosmic mandate longer than any other pre-flood city, a flood that ends the era, and then silence, and then the world again. The Sumerians, who thought about time in multiples of 3,600, believed that what is truly important persists. The Nam-Lugal descends, relocates, descends again. Dumuzi dies in summer and returns in spring. The flood sweeps over and kingship comes back down from heaven. There is loss in this cosmology, but not final loss. There is ending, but not absolute ending. The prism was fired precisely because clay that is fired does not decay. The scribe who made it was not being poetic. He was being practical about permanence. The question he has left us, what were the 3 kings of Bad-tibira? What did their 108,000 years mean? Who was Dumuzi on the throne before the flood? Is not a question he expected to be answered quickly. It is a question he expected to outlast him. It has outlasted him by 4,000 years. Tonight it has reached you. You have heard the evidence as it stands. The prism, the mathematics, the mythology, the absent excavation, the manuscript that lacks the section, the shepherd god at the threshold of catastrophe. You have heard what the scholars argue and what the tradition insists, and where the two diverge. The space between them is not empty. It is full of the specific, detailed, internally consistent tradition that the Sumerians maintained across 2,000 years of living civilization, a tradition they apparently considered important enough to preserve in clay, to copy and recopy, to transmit through floods and conquests and collapses and rebuildings, all the way to a prism in Oxford that someone bought in southern Iraq in 1922 and gave to a museum where it sits today, waiting to be asked the questions it was always intended to generate. The kingship descended from heaven. It was in Eridu. Then it was in Bad-tibira. Then the flood swept over, and then it descended again. Whatever that means, whatever Bad-tibira held, and what Dumuzi represented at the end of the world that was, the tradition kept saying it, kept pressing it into clay, kept copying it into new tablets when old ones crumbled, as if the act of remembering was itself a form of the knowledge being preserved, as if telling it again and again in the dark before sleep was how you kept something alive. Rest now. The prism is still turning.